December 15, 1944. The Colorado Rockies. When the transport trucks rolled through the iron gates of Camp Carson's auxiliary facility, the temperature had already dropped to 15 degrees below zero. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, turning the mountain landscape into a white wilderness that seemed to erase the boundary between earth and sky. Inside those trucks sat 42 German women, captured during the final Allied push through France and Belgium. They wore thin auxiliary uniforms, never designed for this kind of cold, their faces pressed against frosted windows as they caught their first glimpse of what would be their prison for the foreseeable future. Major Catherine Walsh stood on the administration building's porch, watching the convoy arrive with a mixture of duty and doubt. She had overseen male POW camps before, facilities in Texas and Arizona where the biggest challenge was heat and boredom. But this assignment was different in every possible way. The War Department had specifically chosen this remote location, nestled at an elevation of 8,000 feet in the Rockies, for reasons that made Walsh uncomfortable. Some officials believed that harsh conditions would break the spirits of enemy prisoners faster than any interrogation. Others simply had nowhere else to put female POWs and chose the most isolated facility available. The women who stepped down from those trucks moved with the mechanical precision of military training, but their eyes betrayed their shock. 23-year-old Marguerite Schneider, a former radio operator from Munich, felt the cold strike her face like a physical blow. She had grown up in Bavaria, knew winter in the Alps, but this was something different. This cold had teeth. Beside her, Clara Hoffman wrapped her arms around herself, her fingers already going numb. At 19 years old, she was the youngest among them, and the fear in her eyes was impossible to hide. The camp itself looked more like a frontier outpost than a military facility. Rough wooden barracks surrounded a central yard, with mountains rising on all sides like prison walls made of stone and ice. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray columns that were quickly torn apart by the wind. Everything about the place spoke of isolation, of distance from anything familiar or safe. Major Walsh stepped forward to address the new arrivals, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Her words were translated by a young corporal who spoke halting German, but the message was clear enough. They would be housed, fed, and treated according to Geneva Convention standards. They would work, they would follow orders, and they would survive the winter. That last part was said with less certainty than Walsh intended. What none of them knew yet, neither the German prisoners nor the American officers, was that survival in this place would require more than just following orders. The mountains had their own rules, their own demands, and learning those rules would transform every woman who passed through that gate. The cold should have taken them. Everyone expected it to. But sometimes the harshest teachers give the most valuable lessons. The camp's support staff arrived the morning after the prisoners, and they were nothing like what anyone expected. Major Walsh had requisitioned additional personnel from the War Department, anticipating military nurses and female officers trained in prisoner management. Instead, she received a telegram explaining that due to personnel shortages, the facility would utilize local civilian contractors for non-security roles. What rolled up to the camp that morning were 5 pickup trucks carrying women who looked like they had been carved from the same stone as the surrounding mountains. Sarah Mackenzie stepped out of the lead truck with the kind of deliberate movement that spoke of someone who never wasted energy. At 47 years old, she had lived in these mountains for 26 years, ever since marrying a rancher whose family had worked this land for 3 generations. Her face was weathered by sun and wind, her hands rough and capable. She wore wool pants, thick boots that had been resoled more times than she could count, and a heavy canvas coat that had belonged to her father. Behind her came 4 other women, ranging in age from 32 to 61, all of them wives or widows of mountain ranchers who knew that winter in the Rockies was something you survived through skill, not luck. Major Walsh met them in her office, struggling to hide her concern. Mrs. Mackenzie, I appreciate you and your colleagues volunteering for this work, but I need to be clear about what we're dealing with here. These are enemy prisoners. They may be women, but they serve the German military. There are security protocols, rules of engagement. Sarah cut her off with a raised hand, not rudely, but with the quiet authority of someone who had dealt with far more immediate dangers than bureaucratic concerns. "Major, with respect, I didn't volunteer to manage your prisoners. I volunteered to keep them alive through the winter. There's a difference." She explained that she and the other mountain wives had been hired to oversee practical operations: food preparation, supply management, maintenance of heating systems, and teaching basic survival skills. The War Department's thinking, as far as Sarah understood it, was that local women would be less threatening to female prisoners while still maintaining the necessary distance that military protocol required. But Sarah had a different understanding of the situation. She had seen what happened to people, any people, who didn't respect what the mountains demanded. Nationality didn't matter when you were fighting frostbite. Pride didn't keep you warm when the temperature dropped to 30 below. The other mountain wives introduced themselves with characteristic brevity. Eleanor Foster, whose husband had died in a mining accident 5 years earlier, leaving her to run their ranch alone. Ruth Chambers, a midwife who had delivered half the babies born in the county over the past 2 decades. Marie Thornton, whose family had been in these mountains since before Colorado was even a state. And Agnes Cole, the oldest among them, whose quiet eyes seemed to measure everything they observed. These were women whose lives had been defined by endurance, by making do with less, by surviving seasons that killed the unprepared. Major Walsh walked them through the facility, explaining the layout and the routines that had been established. The German women watched from the windows of their barracks as these strange new figures moved through the camp. They looked nothing like the female officers the prisoners had encountered before, nothing like the military nurses or administrative personnel. These women moved differently, carried themselves with a kind of solid rootedness that spoke of people who belonged exactly where they were. Marguerite whispered to Clara in German, "Who are they?" Clara shook her head, pressing her cold hands against the window glass. "I don't know, but they don't look afraid of anything." The first week passed in a fog of cold and confusion. The German women moved through their daily routines with mechanical precision, standing for morning roll call, eating meals in the cramped dining hall, and returning to their barracks, where they huddled under thin military-issue blankets that did almost nothing against the penetrating cold. At night, the temperature inside the barracks dropped so low that their breath formed clouds above their bunks. Some of the women cried quietly in the darkness. Others lay awake, wondering if they would see spring or if the cold would claim them first. Sarah Mackenzie and the other mountain wives observed all of this without comment. They checked the heating systems, delivered firewood to each barracks, and ensured that meals were hot and substantial. But they did not offer comfort, did not speak beyond what was necessary, and maintained a careful distance that puzzled both the prisoners and some of the American guards. Corporal James Bennett, a young man from Florida who found the Colorado winter almost as unbearable as the prisoners did, finally asked Sarah why she and her colleagues seemed so indifferent to the women's obvious suffering. Sarah stopped stacking firewood and looked at him with an expression that was patient but firm. "Son, you think we're being cruel by not coddling them?" She gestured toward the barracks where muffled sounds of distress could be heard. "Those women are fighting the cold the wrong way. They're treating it like an enemy they can resist through willpower alone. Every mountain wife learns the same lesson her first winter up here. The cold doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't respond to crying or complaints or prayers. You can't fight it. You can only learn to live with it." She explained that the mountain wives had made a deliberate choice to remain silent during this initial period. They were waiting, watching to see which of the German women would exhaust themselves through useless resistance and which would begin to observe, to pay attention, to notice how the mountain women themselves moved through the cold. "You can't teach someone to survive until they're ready to learn," Sarah said. "And they're not ready until they stop fighting what they can't change and start paying attention to what they can control." In the barracks, Marguerite Schneider was beginning to understand something without anyone having to explain it to her. She had noticed that while she and the other prisoners shivered constantly despite wrapping themselves in every available blanket, the mountain wives who entered the barracks to deliver supplies never seemed affected by the cold. It wasn't that they were impervious to it, she realized, but that they moved differently. They wore layers that made sense, wool against the skin, sturdy canvas on the outside. They never rushed, never wasted movement. When they opened doors, they did so quickly and decisively, minimizing the time cold air could enter. When they worked, they kept their bodies moving at a steady pace that generated warmth without causing sweat that would later freeze. Marguerite began to mimic these behaviors without consciously deciding to do so. She started wearing all her clothing in layers rather than piling blankets on top of herself. She noticed that keeping her feet moving, even just shifting her weight from one foot to the other, kept circulation going in a way that standing still did not. She paid attention to how the mountain wives positioned themselves in relation to windows and doors, always choosing spots that minimized exposure to drafts. These small observations began to make a difference, tiny improvements in comfort that felt like victories in a battle she was only beginning to understand how to fight. Clara noticed her friends' changes and began copying them as well. Soon, others started paying attention. The crying at night decreased, not because the cold had lessened, but because the women were starting to spend their energy differently. They were beginning to watch, to learn, to understand that survival here would require different skills than any they had learned in their previous lives. And Sarah Mackenzie, standing at the window of the administration building, noticed these changes with the practiced eye of someone who had seen this transformation before. The breaking point came on December 23rd, when a blizzard struck with a ferocity that surprised even the mountain wives. Wind howled through the compound with such force that it tore loose boards from barracks walls and created snowdrifts that reached halfway up doorframes. The heating system in Barrack 3 failed completely just after midnight, and by dawn, the women inside were in genuine danger. Major Walsh ordered an emergency evacuation, moving all 42 prisoners into the main dining hall, where the large wood stove could keep them warm until repairs could be made. Sarah Mackenzie arrived at first light with the other mountain wives, pulling a sledge loaded with supplies through snow that came up to their knees. She assessed the situation with a single, sweeping glance. Women huddled together for warmth, several showing early signs of hypothermia, hands so cold they could barely grip the cups of hot water that guards were distributing. Without a word, Sarah began issuing instructions to her fellow mountain wives in the clipped, efficient manner of someone managing a crisis. Eleanor started organizing the women into smaller groups. Ruth began checking each prisoner for frostbite. Marie and Agnes disappeared into the supply room and returned with armloads of wool socks, scarves, and mittens. But it was what Sarah did next that changed everything. She walked directly to Marguerite, who was trying unsuccessfully to warm her hands by breathing on them, and took both of Marguerite's hands in her own rough, calloused ones. "Stop," Sarah said firmly. "You're doing it wrong." Through the translator, she explained that breathing on frozen hands added moisture that would only make them colder. Instead, she showed Marguerite how to tuck her hands into her armpits, using her body's core heat to warm them gradually. Then she demonstrated the proper way to layer clothing, starting with wool against the skin, adding insulation, and finishing with a wind-breaking outer layer. For the first time since arriving at the camp, Sarah spoke to the prisoners not as enemies or subordinates, but as students who needed to learn if they wanted to survive. "The cold doesn't care what country you're from," she said, her words translated into German by the corporal. "It doesn't care about politics or war or who's right and who's wrong. Up here, there's only two kinds of people: those who learn to respect the mountain and those who die on it." She paused, looking around at the 42 faces watching her. "You want to live through this winter? Then you're going to learn to work with your hands. Real work. The kind that keeps you warm and keeps you useful." What followed was an unexpected transformation. Sarah announced that starting the next morning, every prisoner would participate in daily survival training. They would learn to chop wood properly, to maintain heating systems, to repair their own clothing and boots, to preserve food, and to read weather patterns. The German women exchanged uncertain glances. They had been soldiers, clerks, radio operators. None of them had chopped wood or mended boots before. But Sarah's expression made it clear this wasn't a request or even an order. It was simply what had to happen if they wanted to survive. The morning after the blizzard, Sarah Mackenzie divided the 42 prisoners into 5 groups, assigning each to one of the mountain wives. Margarete found herself in Sarah's group, along with 7 other women, standing in the bitter cold behind the main building where a pile of unsplit logs waited. Sarah handed Margarete an axe without ceremony, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. "Show me how you think this works," she said through the translator. Margarete gripped the axe awkwardly, raised it above her head, and brought it down with all her strength. The blade bounced off the log, the impact jarring her shoulders painfully. Sarah nodded as if this was exactly what she expected. "You're fighting the wood," Sarah explained, taking the axe back. "Mountain wives don't fight anything. We work with what we've got." She demonstrated the proper stance, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent. She showed how to read the grain of the wood, to find the natural splits and weaknesses. When she swung, it wasn't with brute force but with precision and rhythm. The blade sank deep into the log, splitting it cleanly. "Strength matters less than technique," she said, "and technique only comes from practice. You'll each split a cord of wood before lunch." Across the compound, Eleanor Foster was teaching her group about fire management. She explained that keeping warm wasn't about building the biggest fire, but about maintaining consistent heat with minimum fuel. She showed them how to arrange logs for maximum efficiency, how to bank coals at night so morning fires could be started quickly, how to recognize when wood was properly seasoned versus dangerously wet. "Fire is like any relationship," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "Give it too much attention and you'll smother it. Ignore it, and it dies. You have to learn the balance." Ruth Chambers had taken her group to the kitchen, where she was teaching food preparation that maximized warmth and nutrition. She showed them how to make thick porridge that would sustain them through morning work, how to render fat for waterproofing boots, how to preserve vegetables in the root cellar where temperature stayed constant even when the surface world froze solid. "Your grandmother probably knew all this," Ruth told them. "But somewhere between her generation and yours, people forgot that survival isn't something you buy. It's something you do with your own hands." Marie Thornton was teaching clothing repair and modification in one of the barracks. She demonstrated how to darn socks so they'd last another season, how to add wool linings to thin jackets, how to create mittens from scraps of fabric and fur. Her weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, each stitch purposeful. "Mountain wives learn early that nothing gets thrown away," she explained. "Everything has value if you know how to use it. That coat you think is worn out? That's 3 good pairs of mittens waiting to be made." Agnes Cole had the smallest group, just 5 women including Clara. She was teaching them to read the mountain itself. They stood outside in the cold, while Agnes pointed to clouds, wind patterns, the way snow clung to certain slopes. She taught them that mountains spoke a language older than any human tongue, and survival meant learning to listen. By early March of 1945, the transformation was impossible to ignore. The German women who had arrived 3 months earlier as shivering, uncertain prisoners now moved through the camp with the confident efficiency of people who understood their environment. Margarete's hands, once soft and unused to labor, were now calloused and capable. She could split a cord of wood in half the time it had taken her initially, and she did so without thinking, her body having learned the rhythm that Sarah had taught her. Clara no longer flinched at the cold but dressed in layers that made sense, moved with purpose that generated warmth, and carried herself with a quiet pride that came from competence. The change went deeper than physical skills. Major Walsh noticed it during morning roll calls. The prisoners stood differently now, with the same solid rootedness she'd observed in the mountain wives. They no longer huddled together for comfort but spaced themselves naturally, efficiently. When wind gusted through the compound, they turned into it rather than away, their faces no longer showing fear but simple acknowledgement. They had stopped fighting the mountain and started living on it. The difference was subtle but profound. Sarah Mackenzie watched these changes with the same quiet observation she brought to everything. She never commented on the prisoner's progress, never offered praise or acknowledgement beyond a slight nod when someone demonstrated proper technique. But in private conversations with Major Walsh, she admitted to being surprised by how quickly the German women had adapted. "City people usually take a full year to learn what these women picked up in 3 months," Sarah said. "Fear is a powerful teacher, I suppose. When you know the cold might kill you, You pay attention in ways comfortable people never do. The relationships between the mountain wives and the prisoners had evolved into something neither group had anticipated. They weren't friendships exactly, but they weren't the distant formality of captor and captive either. They were more like the bond between master craftsmen and apprentices, built on mutual respect for skill and shared understanding of what the mountain demanded. Eleanor had begun teaching her group advanced techniques for reading animal tracks in snow, useful knowledge for anyone living in these elevations. Ruth shared family recipes that had sustained mountain families through hard winters for generations. Marie showed the prisoners how to make soap from ash and fat, how to tan leather, how to do dozens of small tasks that added up to self-sufficiency. Agnes Cole had developed an unexpected connection with Clara, who showed a natural aptitude for weather reading. The old woman would stand with the young German prisoner at dawn, both of them silent as they studied the sky, the wind, the quality of light on distant peaks. Words were unnecessary. Agnes would point, Clara would nod, and understanding would pass between them in the ancient language of people who lived close to the earth. These moments of shared observation created a bond that transcended nationality, politics, or the circumstances that had brought them together. Spring began its slow arrival in the high country. In late March, Major Walsh announced that the prisoners would be permitted to write letters home for the first time since their capture. The Red Cross had established mail routes through neutral Switzerland, and families in Germany would finally learn that their daughters and sisters had survived. The announcement was met with a complicated silence. Some women immediately requested paper and pen. Others sat quietly, staring at their hands, unsure what they could possibly write about the transformation they had undergone. Margarete sat at the rough wooden table in the dining hall, a blank sheet of paper before her, struggling to find words that would make sense to her mother back in Munich. How could she explain that she had learned more about survival in 3 months of captivity than in 23 years of life in Germany? How could she describe the strange respect she had developed for the American women who had taught her skills her own grandmother might have known but never passed down? She wrote and crossed out several attempts before finally settling on simple truth. Mama, I have learned to split wood, to read the weather, to make myself useful in ways I never imagined. The cold should have broken me. Instead, it taught me what I am capable of enduring. Clara's letter to her older brother was even more direct. She described Agnes Cole without mentioning her nationality, writing only about an old woman who understood mountains the way sailors understood the sea. She taught me that survival is not about strength but about paying attention, Clara wrote. Every morning we stand together and read the sky. She does not speak much, but I learn more from her silence than I ever learned from any teacher in school. I think grandmother would have liked her. She paused before adding a line that surprised even herself. I am not the same person who left Germany. I do not know if that is good or bad, but it is true. Not all the letters were so contemplative. Some women wrote about the hardship, the cold, the difficult labor. They described aching muscles and blistered hands, long days of work that left them exhausted. But even in these complaints, there was an undertone of something else. Pride, perhaps, or the satisfaction that comes from discovering capabilities you never knew you possessed. One woman wrote to her sister, "You would laugh to see me now, splitting logs like a farmer's wife, but I can do, in 1 hour, what took me all day when I first arrived. My hands are ugly now, rough and scarred, but they are strong." The mountain wives learned about these letters from the translator, who shared some of the contents with Sarah over coffee in the administration building. Sarah listened without comment, her weathered face revealing nothing. But that evening, she mentioned to Eleanor that the German women were writing home about what they'd learned. Eleanor smiled slightly. "Good," she said. "Maybe they'll teach someone else when they get back. Mountain skills shouldn't die just because people move to cities." Sarah nodded, recognizing the deeper truth in Eleanor's words. They had been teaching more than survival techniques. They had been passing down a way of seeing the world. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. News reached the camp by radio in the early afternoon, crackling through static as the announcer declared Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. In towns and cities across America, celebrations erupted spontaneously. Church bells rang, strangers embraced in the streets, and people wept with relief that the killing had finally ended. At the remote Colorado facility, the news was met with profound silence. The German prisoners gathered in the dining hall, listening to the translator relay the details of their country's defeat. Some women cried quietly, others sat motionless, faces blank with shock. Marguerite felt a strange numbness wash over her, unable to process what this moment meant for her future. Major Walsh addressed them that evening with news they had been expecting but dreading. Repatriation procedures would begin immediately. Within 6 to 8 weeks, they would be transported to processing centers, then shipped back to Germany. She spoke about logistics and timelines, but Margaret barely heard the words. She kept thinking about the letters she had received in response to her own, letters that painted a picture of a Germany that no longer existed. Her mother wrote of Hamburg in ruins, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Her childhood home was gone, destroyed in bombing raids. Her father's factory was a burned shell. Half the people she had grown up with were dead or missing. That night, the prisoners talked among themselves in urgent, whispered conversations. What were they returning to? The Germany they had left no longer existed. Cities were devastated, the economy destroyed, food scarce, and the future uncertain. Some women had received no letters at all despite months of waiting, meaning their families were likely dead or displaced beyond the Red Cross's ability to locate them. Others had learned that their homes were now in territories occupied by Soviet forces, making return even more complicated and dangerous. The prospect of going back felt less like liberation and more like being cast into an abyss. Clara approached Margarete after midnight, unable to sleep. "What will we do there?" she asked. "We learned to survive mountains and cold. What use is that in bombed cities with no wood to split, no fires to tend?" Marguerite had no answer. She had been thinking the same thing. For 3 months, they had learned to be useful, to contribute, to take pride in their capabilities. They had found purpose in the daily work of survival. Returning to Germany meant returning to chaos, uncertainty, and the judgment of a population that would see them as soldiers who had failed, as women who had been captured and changed by their captors. The mountain wives continued their work as if nothing had changed, maintaining the same routines and expectations. But Sarah Mackenzie noticed the shift in the prisoners' demeanor, the way their eyes had taken on a distant, worried quality. She understood that look. She had seen it before in the faces of people facing impossible choices, weighing one kind of hardship against another, trying to decide between two futures that both promised suffering. 2 weeks after the war's end, Margarete approached Sarah Mackenzie while the older woman was inspecting the winter equipment that would be stored for the season. Marguerite had practiced what she wanted to say, rehearsing the English words until she felt confident she could express herself without the translator. "Mrs. Mackenzie," she began, her accent still thick but her pronunciation clear. "May I ask you a question that is not about work?" Sarah set down the coil of rope she had been examining and gave Marguerite her full attention, the same focused regard she brought to everything. "When you first came to these mountains," Marguerite continued carefully, "did you ever want to leave? When the winter was hard, when you were afraid, did you think about going back to wherever you came from before?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her weathered face thoughtful. Finally, she gestured for Margarete to sit beside her on a stack of crates. "I came here from Illinois," Sarah said. "Flat country, easy winters compared to this. I married a man I barely knew and followed him to these mountains because that's what women did back then. That first winter, I cried myself to sleep almost every night. I was cold, lonely, scared, and convinced I'd made a terrible mistake." She paused, looking out at the peaks that surrounded them. "I wrote letters to my sister begging her to send me money for a train ticket home, but she never sent it. Years later, she told me she burned those letters without showing them to anyone because she knew I was just frightened, not actually ready to give up. She was right. Somewhere during that first winter, I stopped asking to leave and started learning to stay. There's a difference." Margarete absorbed these words, recognizing something in Sarah's story that resonated with her own experience. "How did you know when you had learned to stay?" she asked. "When the mountain stopped feeling like my enemy and started feeling like my home," Sarah replied. "Not because it got easier or more comfortable, but because I got stronger and more capable. Home isn't always the place you came from. Sometimes it's the place where you learned who you really are." She looked directly at Marguerite. "I'm guessing you're not asking about my past. You're asking about your future." Marguerite nodded, unable to trust her voice. Sarah continued, "Can't tell you what to do. That's between you and whatever you believe in. But I can tell you this. Endurance isn't about going back to how things were. It's about moving forward with what you've learned." That evening, Marguerite called a meeting of all the prisoners in her barracks. She spoke in German, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside. "We need to talk honestly about what we're facing," she said. "Some of us have nothing to return to. Others are returning to something worse than nothing. But all of us have learned something here that we didn't know before. We learned that we're stronger than we thought. The question is what we do with that strength." 23 years later, in 1968, Marguerite Schneider stood in a small classroom in Denver, Colorado, teaching a group of recent immigrants the skills she had learned during that transformative winter. She had returned to Germany as ordered in the summer of 1945, spent 3 difficult years helping rebuild Hamburg, and then applied for immigration to the United States in 1948. The process had taken 2 more years, but in 1950 she stepped off a train in Colorado Springs and made her way back to the mountains that had taught her what endurance truly meant. She had written to Sarah Mackenzie before returning, uncertain of her reception. Sarah's response had been characteristically brief: "Mountains don't care about politics. Come if you want to stay." Clara had made a different choice, remaining in Germany and using her skills to help establish rural education programs teaching traditional survival techniques to a generation that had lost connection with the land. They wrote letters faithfully, sharing how the lessons they had learned continued to shape their lives in different countries. Anna had immigrated to Canada, Elena to Argentina, others scattered across the globe. But all of them carried the same core understanding. Survival was not about where you were born, but about what you were willing to learn and endure. Sarah Mackenzie had passed away in 1963 at the age of 66, still living in the same mountain ranch where she had spent 45 years. At her funeral, Marguerite had stood beside Eleanor Foster, Ruth Chambers, and Agnes Cole, the surviving mountain wives who had taught a group of enemy prisoners that strength came from skill, not nationality. Agnes, now 84 years old and still sharp-eyed, had squeezed Marguerite's hand and said simply, "She'd be proud you came back." Not, "Many people choose the hard place when they've got easier options." Now, teaching in her classroom, Marguerite showed her students, refugees from various conflicts, how to layer clothing properly, how to read weather patterns, how to make the most of limited resources. She taught them that survival was not about waiting for conditions to improve, but about adapting to conditions as they existed. Her hands, still calloused after all these years, demonstrated techniques that Sarah had shown her in that winter of 1944. She never mentioned that she had learned these skills as a prisoner of war. She only said that a wise woman in the mountains had taught her that endurance was something you practiced, not something you were born with. On cold mornings, when snow fell on Denver and the mountains were visible in the distance, Marguerite would pause and remember standing beside Agnes Cole, both of them silent as they read the sky. She remembered Sarah's rough hands guiding her grip on an axe handle, Eleanor's patient voice explaining fire management, Ruth's practical wisdom about making do with less. The cold had never left her, not really, but it had stopped being something to fear and become something that reminded her of who she had learned to be. The mountain had taught her, and now she taught others. The lesson continued.